Whenever the topic of good summer 2022 anime comes up, people always bring up Call of the Night, which is weird because that show is hot garbage. The story itself is about Yamori Ko, a 14-year-old boy who decides to wander around at night, meeting a plucky vampire named Nazuna who shows him the freedom and joy of the nightlife. Nazuna may be a vampire, but in this world, vampires are different than you or I am familiar with. They do need blood to survive, but sucking blood from a victim doesn't kill them or turn them into a vampire, most of the time at least. It can turn them into a vampire, but only if the victim is in love with the vampire who bit them. Ko, who loves the idea of living free like Nazuna does all the time, wants to become a vampire, and so starts hanging around Nazuna with the intention of falling in love with her so that he can become a vampire too. Nazuna is fine with this because his blood is especially delicious, so she frequently feeds from him. The story is praised for its chill vibes, excellent visuals, and interesting themes. The problem with that being that the story is unsettling, visually messy, and thematically barren, so what the hell is going on? Before we get into the story as a whole, I want to talk about the visuals. A lot of people are praising the visuals using words like immaculate. Personally, the word I want to use is unacceptable. I think a particularly illustrative example is the lighting. You ready? I'm going to ruin this show for you. So, in this show, a lot of time is spent out in the open streets, and a lot of the shots are bathed in some neon light. I think the color of which is supposed to represent the protagonist's mental state or something else symbolic like that. So here we have a scene bathed in purple light. Very artsy, very aesthetically interesting. One question though. Why aren't the characters tinted purple? Look, how to do this isn't a secret. Anime has been doing it for ages. If your ambient light doesn't affect how your characters are tinted, but it does affect the background, then the characters don't look like they are part of the background. And this is on top of the fact that the backgrounds are not painted, but instead either rendered or just straight up edited photographs. I don't know enough about background design to tell, but the end result is the characters feeling almost photoshopped into the environment. Now, Kizu Monogatari did this a while back with edited photographs for backgrounds to pretty great effect, but the key difference is intentionality and effort. This is an intentionally unorthodox disconnect between background and character animation, which is meant to evoke a mood that manages to keep up a grounded, visceral feeling, while also seeming fantastical. This, on the other hand, is straight up careless, not to mention just unfinished. Okay, so there is this anime, Prison School. One of the things that's so great about it is how intricately constructed its humor is, far more than you'd realize on a single surface level viewing. And one of the things that is done to make it work so well is absurdism. The anime is able to concoct these truly outrageous scenarios while making them still feel oddly grounded by frog boiling you into them. And the art style is actually a really important means by which they do this. See, part of the point of the anime is that these characters are in high school, but they are drawn like adults. Not just in the fact that some of them have big boobs or whatever, but in basically every conceivable way. They are presented as mature beyond their age to the point of it being visual comedy. And it's a representation of how seriously all these characters take the dumb stuff that's happening to them. This scene, where one of the characters commits social suicide by pooping their pants in the middle of class as part of some grand scheme, no, we do not have time to get into that. It's obviously a very silly situation, but for the characters, it is the most dire, noble sacrifice a person can make, and the fact they look like this instead of like this makes it that much more engaging and comedic. Prison School, like Call of the Night, was an adaptation of a manga, and in the anime adaptation, they made this choice I just love. It's something so subtle, but which does so much to add to this serious businessy vibe that the show goes for. The animators take so much care to animate all of the creases on people's clothing. I don't know exactly why, but this subtle choice has such an intense effect and really hammers in the idea that to the characters, everything that's happening to them is as real as can be. It's not something you're supposed to notice, it's just a subtle thing that's supposed to make the comedy that much more impactful. Compare that to whatever the hell is happening with the lighting in Call of the Night. This wasn't a choice that was done to make the story more effective, they did it because it looks artsy. because it signals to the viewer, this story is high concept, but it has the end result of also just looking like complete garbage if you stop and look at any of these scenes for more than a second. It's not just the lighting, though. The animation is pretty bad, too. I know they poured their money into the first shot in order to grab everyone's attention, budgeting, but as a whole, the show is largely unimpressive in the animation department. There's not that much done with character animation in normal dialogue scenes, which would be fine if this story wasn't a story about dialogue. Variety is a big issue here, and to really get that point across, let me make another comparison. So, there's this thing called an otome isekai. It's a genre of isekai that is very, very popular in Korea. There's a big online novel boom in Korea for otome isekais, which is comparable to the Japanese boom in harem isekai light novels. But it's aimed at girls instead of boys, and instead of getting adapted into anime, they get adapted into comic strips. You can find these everywhere on Top Us Tunes. These comics are rushed out there. They use a lot of pre-generated assets, backgrounds, and textures. They copy and paste a lot of things like a character's eyes, and they use other time-saving measures like that so they can keep up with a weekly release schedule while also making decently long full-color chapters. It's not high art visuals-wise, but unlike Call of the Night, it's not pretending to be. A lot of my favorites have terrible art, but easily the funniest example is Limited Time Princess. If you haven't right away noticed the most glaring problem with this art, I don't blame you. It took me a while as well, but once you see it, you can't unsee it. Almost every shot of these characters is from a front-facing angle. Call of the Night suffers from a similar problem. Now, there are shots from a wide variety of angles, but they're weirdly spread out. I'm sure if you tried really hard, you could come up with a whole montage of shots from all sorts of different angles, but it would take more effort than it should. Even trash anime usually get this right. Say what you will about In Another World with My Smartphone, but at the very least it's not a labor of time to find characters in that anime being drawn from something other than the front, sides, or back. When the characters in Call of the Night are drawn from an angle, too, it's usually pretty static animation. As a matter of fact, the animation is pretty lacking all throughout the anime. On top of that, there are just some downright questionable decisions littered all over the place. Not to labor on them too much, but I'd like to bring attention to this absolutely pathetic attempt to merge a tiny protagonist with a background. This moment where him falling off of a swing set felt so unnatural that I thought it was due to in-universe telekinesis, and then whatever the hell this monstrosity is. Before we move on, I want to circle back to the lighting, because it's more significant than one might realize at first. In sharp contrast to, for example, the clothing creases in Prison School, the lighting doesn't have very much of a greater purpose. The protagonist is really boring and lacking in depth. The idea of needing to use symbolism this abstract to convey his mental state or the nature of his experience is patently absurd. Much like shoving all of your animation budget into the first shot, the lighting exists to create an initial impression of artsiness and substance where there really is none. You could argue that them failing to finish the lighting process and keeping characters colored flat actually adds to this effect. If this was like Fate Stay Night and they did put effort into doing the lighting properly, you'd actually notice it less. You'd spend less time thinking about how artsy and cool the lighting is and spend more time just engaged with the story, because the lighting would have actually been doing its job of engaging you with the story. This is actually a perfect microcosm of the story as a whole. It wears the paint of a deeper, more interesting story, but it's all surface level. It's far more concerned with appearing deep than actually being deep. I don't think it did this in a cynical way. I think they just had the same thought process as the people who are impressed by this stuff. They have a certain idea of what deep and interesting means from an aesthetic point of view and just pursued that aesthetic, thinking that's what being deep meant. It's no different from Darling in the Franxx putting in a dream sequence and thinking it made them Evangelion. Mother's Basement described this as lo-fi Fooly Cooly, an assessment so absurd on every level that I struggle to believe he actually watched Fooly Cooly. The first obvious problem with this is that it misses the entire point of what Fooly Cooly is about. For reference, Fooly Cooly is a 6-part OVA series made by old school studio Gainax, which became a long-beloved classic. It's about a 12-year-old boy named Naota whose life gets turned upside down by a wacky older woman named Haruko, and there's a bunch of weird science fantasy stuff along the way. The comparison between Call of the Night and Fooly Cooly is something you can immediately understand. Young boy's coming-of-age story involving an older woman with pink hair who shows him how to live. That would make sense as a comparison if you thought that's what Fooly Cooly was about. It is what Call of the Night is about, but Fooly Cooly is, well, Fooly Cooly is a lot of things, but one of the things it definitely is a deconstruction of this kind of story. To put it incredibly bluntly and concisely, Fooly Cooly was a story about how young boys being led around by sexually aggressive older women is a bad thing, actually. Haruko was the villain, and the first scene of the story is the protagonist being molested. Considering how Fooly Cooly is rightfully considered a classic, this is clearly supposed to be a compliment. Saying that it is lo-fi Fooly Cooly is saying that this show has some amount of substance, but he's really just making a comparison between a story which goes into an in-depth, nuanced, and insightful deconstruction of a terrible trope and a show that just uses the terrible trope. There is a phrase for the kind of story this is. It's far less glamorous, but it's far more honest. Call of the Night is a manic pixie dream girl story. This is a tried and true formula that's been popular both within the States and abroad for decades now and is rightfully considered a pejorative. It's a specific brand of wish fulfillment that's trying really hard to be deep while kneecapping the writing, and is mostly praised as deep by the kind of people the wish fulfillment appeals to. The basic concept of a manic pixie dream girl story is this. You have a male protagonist whose life is in some way uneventful or unfulfilling, and then a female character who knows how to live enters his life, whisks him away on a series of misadventures, and through this process he learns to live in a more fulfilling way. There are a lot of problems with this, but the first one is the requirement that the protagonist be kind of bland. After all, the girl's eccentricities are meant to contrast the boy's lack of anything that interesting. He's meant to be relatable, someone you can project yourself onto, and so he's almost always a bit of a blank slate, but he's also the person going through all the development, experiencing all the conflict, which means that these stories are by their very nature character studies of blank slates. They are necessarily lacking in substance. The next problem is one of predictability. Now, predictability is not necessarily a bad thing in stories. The audience expecting something and then it happening can be very satisfying and engaging. Like how you know that any conflict between two love interests will inevitably get resolved. You're looking forward to when it finally happens, so when it does, it feels satisfying. You run into problems, however, when the inevitable conclusion doesn't make sense outside the context of trope awareness. An excellent example is when Nazuna and Ko go to a pool party. She gets hit on by some guys, he sits back and watches and gets kinda jealous, and then, eventually, he works up the courage to go and drag her away, essentially marking his territory. The thing to understand about all of this is that it was all according to Nazuna's plan. She didn't scheme the whole thing out ahead of time, but her response when getting hit on by guys was to act like she wasn't bothered by it so that she could drive Ko to action. It's not that she wasn't bothered, or even that she was bothered but pretended not to be. How she felt about this situation wasn't really something that was important. It wasn't anything that the story delved into. All she did was take the series of actions that would take the story in the direction it needed to go for Ko to get the character development he was clearly being set up to get. The end effect is that she feels like a prop in this whole exchange. Her getting hit on isn't something that's happening to her, it's something that's happening to Ko. That's how the story frames it, and she handles it the way she does so that the story can frame it that way. Her eccentricities and mischievousness, her role as a crazy kooky dream girl, are merely used as an excuse for her to be narratively convenient. The point of the scene is to have Ko grow, and for this to count as him growing, there needs to be some amount of wisdom here. Something that Ko has learned. In this case, he learned not to let other men hit on his woman. Not that they're dating at this point or anything, but he got jealous, so he asserted his dominance. Our enjoyment of this scene hinges on us looking at that and going, yes, this is a positive takeaway. It is, however, not a positive takeaway, or at the very least not a very effective one, and not just because it's kind of creepy. It's also dumb, or more specifically, dumbed down. What the woman is feeling in a situation like this is probably a bit important when deciding how a guy should act in this situation. The story, however, does not concern itself with that, and so any conclusion it reaches is necessarily misinformed. This is where the wish fulfillment comes in. In spite of this being a really bad message, or at the very least a poorly executed one, it is a very satisfying message for a certain type of person. If you personally identify with Ko, but not Nazuna, then it's a very affirming message. It's a satisfying situation to place yourself in. And so the idea that this is actually deep and not really stupid is also appealing. And since it's the answer the show is guiding you towards, it's pretty easy to just accept uncritically. A show gives a message, mulling it over feels nice, so it must be onto something. You know how I said the pretentious lighting was a good metaphor for the show as a whole? This is why. The entire story is like this. Every time Nazuna does something that shows Ko what it's really like to live, it's entirely for Ko's benefit. If there is some deeper meaning as to why Nazuna feels compelled to do all this for this boy, it's just an excuse on the story's part. More so a post hoc justification for why this story makes sense, as opposed to being what the story is about. Because it's not about Nazuna, the interesting, fun character. It's about Ko, the boring character we can relate to. Once again, this is a character study of a blank slate. The whole thing gets so much worse, though, because you see, this story doesn't just have a manic pixie dream girl. It has a manic pixie dream harem. Alright, so, Nazuna is a vampire, and vampire turn other people into vampires by biting people who are in love with them. Now, it's revealed that Nazuna is weird among vampires for not actively trying to reproduce. And ever since the local squad of vampires learned that Nazuna was hanging out around some boy, but wasn't planning on turning him, things have gotten a bit heated behind the scenes. Ko currently knows too much, so a group of 5 vampire girls let him know that he needs to fall in love with one of them and turn into a vampire, otherwise they will have to kill him. Now, let's not beat around the bush here. This is a harem manga plot, which makes sense because this is a harem manga, at least in spirit. But the harem genre is all about suspending disbelief about how women would normally act. And this is a problem for Call of the Night because this is a story about how women act. As you will soon see, what we're about to witness is a very particular kind of story. It is a story about women written by a man for other men. When I say that it's about women, I don't mean that it just has prominent female characters and is about those characters, but that the fact they are female is a core part of their characters. These women see it as their biological duty to seduce men so that they can spread the vampire virus. They form no small part of their identity around the specific tactics they use for seducing men and around the degree to which they are seen as desirable by men. The way that the first one got into contact with Ko happened like this. He saw her get hit on by some guys and reject them, and then she approached him, at which point she asked him what he thought, and began to go on a short soliloquy about her relationship with seducing men and how her opinion of it has changed over time. That was her idea of a casual conversation starter. I hope I don't need to say this, but this isn't how women talk, which is to say, this isn't how people talk. But don't worry, it gets worse when he gets taken to the Vampire Titty Council. They take turns using various tactics to try and seduce him and have internal commentary about what they think of one another's methods. The means by which they attract men is clearly a source of identity for them. This all gets tied together nicely when they are shocked that the methods they use don't work. In fact, it seems to somewhat bother them. Ko has as one of his two-dimensional character traits that he doesn't really understand love and doesn't fall in love easily, something which seems to shock and intrigue these girls. This detail is similar to the detail of how Nazuna doesn't really like love talk and just can't handle it. It gives the protagonist power and sway over all the pretty girls with regards to romantic matters. It's part of the wish fulfillment. All of this is a really shaky way to depict your female characters. No matter what development you throw on top of this foundation, you're never going to escape the fact that these characters are contextualized primarily via how they line up with a fairly sexist archetype. The idea of a woman who uses their sexuality to exploit and gain the upper hand over men. Now, I'm not saying there's no situation in the real world where women do this, but at this point, they make up more than half the cast, and the only male character so far is the person they are trying to gain advantage over. This is a form of narrative tension. Every step the story takes to subvert this trope, to humanize and disarm them, will serve only to resolve that tension, to rob them of the power they were attempting to have, to prove them wrong and defeat the cunning seductress, bringing them down to the level of the viewer. I mean, that's what we see when he subverts their expectations by not falling for them. These women, of course, are all more interesting than our protagonist and aid in his quest of self-actualization, all while he winds up solving whatever problems they have, leading to them thinking very positively of him. Call of the Night gives us a colorful cast of characters and tells a story about how all of that has to do with this one kind of boring guy. Now is a really good time to remind you all that Yamori Ko, the protagonist, is 14. This show makes me want to take a shower. Call of the Night is ultimately a story about dialogue, which isn't a problem on its own, but in order for a story like that to work, the dialogue needs to be good, which is a luxury that Call of the Night does not have. Dialogue is pretty versatile and nuanced as a tool. It can be done a lot of different ways and to a lot of different effects, so it can be a bit tricky to analyze, but a good framework for understanding it is the idea of density. In other words, how much is the story getting done per line of dialogue? Now, very little of Call of the Night's dialogue is offensively bad. What it is mediocre. There is this problem where the manga is really inefficient with its dialogue, especially its humor. I chose a chapter at random, chapter 7, and looked for the first joke of the chapter, and it happens to be the first page. The entire first page is one joke. This one girl, Akira, who's a friend of Ko's, says she wants to ask him something. We see Nazuna being quirky, and then she asks what's wrong with Nazuna. Now, there are a lot of problems with this. The first is that it's just not a very good joke. I know that humor is subjective, but there are a lot of amateur mistakes and not a lot of clever choices here. For one, the joke is centered around pointing out how quirky and weird Nazuna is, but she's not doing anything that exceptional. The contrast it's trying to highlight is just really mild. The second problem is a lack of specificity in word choice. Nothing specific about what Nazuna is doing made its way into the quip. So the whole thing feels kind of toothless and difficult to engage with. It hasn't given itself much to work with in the first place, and then it goes and just doesn't use half of what's on the page. At this point, we're only a few degrees more sophisticated than a slide whistle sound effect. Besides the joke just not being funny, it doesn't really do much to set the scene. Now, this moment here is in media res. Ko is thinking to himself, asking how he got into this mess, and then the first half of the chapter will be him getting into this mess. That's the point of this page. It's a flash forward. But the joke here doesn't really do much to make us curious about this scene. Like, for example, if Nazuna was badgering Ko's friend here with questions, then there'd be some tension. And so, when it goes unresolved and we return to the present, there'd be some minor weight to the fact that we just saw any of that, but as things are, nothing is really done with the dialogue to make the scene particularly interesting. Next, on page 2, we return to the present. We have Nazuna commenting on how Ko has been leaving their get-togethers early. He rebuts it's already 3:30, they go back and forth a bit, leading her jokingly accusing him of treating this as just a physical relationship. They go back and forth a bit more before she accuses him of going to see his friend Akira, who tends to be up around now. He denies this. Alright, so first off, this page starts with some really lazy expository dialogue, telling us about a trend rather than showing it to us. We then exit exposition mode and enter joke mode, where she teases him a bunch, with most of her lines being jokes and most of his lines being really assembly line straight man responses. We then exit joke mode and go into plot development mode as we establish through implication that he's going to meet his friend. As you can see, we have an issue where the dialogue only really tries to do one thing at a time, a problem which continues into the next page where, rather than him saying something that adds to the scene, he just says something that re-establishes what the last page just established, that he's pretending not to be meeting Akira and doesn't want Nazuna to know, but this time in the form of a joke. Once we get back to the joking, we're not establishing anything new. He meets up with Akira and then goes on an internal monologue about what his conversations with her are like, rather than just showing us one of the conversations. What we do see them talk about is a conversation about the conversation that we didn't see. It's all very roundabout and awkward. He starts to wonder if she likes him, only to then notice Nazuna sneaking about. This is the first time this chapter that information got shared with us during a moment that is also supposed to be a joke. She says that she's figured him out. He freaks out, worrying that she sounds mad. She tells him to shoot his shot with Akira while slapping him really hard on the shoulder. He denies that he's hanging out with Akira for romantic reasons, and then internally expresses relief that Nazuna's not mad after all. This here is actually a huge problem. The author really shouldn't have felt like he had to include Ko's internal commentary. When Ko mentions in his head that she sounds mad, that's to express tone to us. And the reason for that is because her dialogue itself does not convey the feeling that she's mad. It can be read that way. It's not as if it explicitly sounds like someone who isn't mad, but the words here generally don't carry any significant emotion. It's not like she said, "So this is what you were getting up to, you rat bastard," or anything else that would have communicated specifically the notion of anger. Similarly, Ko expresses relief that she's not mad via internal monologue because what we see from her could just as easily be interpreted as her being happy-go-lucky as it could be interpreted as her hiding her anger. And we just got told she sounds angry, so it can be easy to make that mistake. And so the author needs to tell us again that now she doesn't sound angry. The whole point of this joke is that at first you are misled into thinking she's mad at Ko with her first line, only for the second line to correct that misunderstanding. But neither of the lines actually do any of the heavy lifting, not without voice actors to read them and put emotion behind them, and so the author has to essentially write footnotes to instruct the reader how to read the joke in order for it to make sense and be funny. You're just telling the joke wrong at that point. Akira asks Ko who this is. Nazuna says her relationship with him is purely physical, which serves only to be a joke and set up for the other two to say comedic lines. Akira points out that the two of them are on very familiar terms. Once again, please note how as soon as it comes time to say something that moves the conversation forward, the jokes stop, and once the jokes start up, do I need to go any further? I originally intended to go through an entire chapter that I chose at random, and I did this in order to drive home the fact that it's not just that there are a few bad dialogue choices here and there. The entire thing is written like this. It's only in rare situations that the dialogue gets anything above mediocre. I feel like that point has been thoroughly demonstrated. Now, if this were, say, a battle shonen, then this wouldn't be that big of a problem. It'd be a point of criticism, but it's really the type of thing that's more a room for improvement than something which really ruins the story. However, that is changed by the fact that this is a story with basically nothing but dialogue, as I've stressed before. A story like this doesn't just need dialogue to not suck, it needs its dialogue to be good for it to really be worth anyone's time. So the fact that the dialogue is actively kind of sloppy is a really important thing to point out. But that's not the only thing the story has going for it, right? There are greater ideas being expressed through those dialogue scenes. The story has important things to say, so why don't we talk about that for a bit? So my battery ran out, and I just spent a whole bunch of time thinking I was recording when I was actually on take a picture mode. So I'm probably going to run out of battery again, because my camcorder kind of sucks. But in between that time and now, I, as you can see, trimmed my beard, and I use an electric trimmer. So the funny thing that happened is that partway through that ran out of battery too, and so I looked absolutely terrible. Like, down here was the only thing that was trimmed off. I had the rest of it going on. I looked like someone in a sitcom who's supposed to be ugly. Anyways, I'm sure if I tried hard enough, I could find a way that was somehow a metaphor for Call of the Night. Theming is a core part of storytelling, and it really consists of two parts. The first is abstract theming, and the other is technical theming. Those are terms that I made up, so don't try looking them up. You're gonna find nothing. Abstract theming is the stuff you're familiar with from English class. This is the idea that a story can raise deeper ideas, which are valuable because the story lets you think about and discuss those ideas. This is story as unnecessarily verbose tweet thread, if a story is making some statement against authoritarianism or whatever. The other, technical theming, is about making sure the different parts of your story are all about the same thing. If you have a character who is interesting in situations where they are forced to choose between trusting themselves or their allies, then you should probably put a lot of situations like that in your story. And then you should probably add in a bunch of characters who are also interesting in those situations, and so on ad infinitum. I describe these as two different things, but that's not really accurate. They're more like two different benefits of the same process. If you make sure all of your conflicts are solved by the power of friendship, that both lets you make a statement about the power of friendship, and make sure the protagonist you made who never shuts up about the power of friendship actually feel like he fits in his role. That process of organizing the greater ideas of your story to line up with one another into a coherent whole is called theming, and it's so important because it has so many downstream effects. Call of the Night does not have good theming. As a matter of fact, I think it might be one of its worst aspects, which is a shame because it really wears its theming on its sleeve. It is very upfront with the fact that it has a message and that it's about something, but what it's about just kind of... we'll get there. To start, I want to cover a core problem that a lot of stories like this suffer from, and it's thematic clumsiness. To illustrate, let me recite to you what is one of the most memorable moments from the early series. Shirakawa is introduced at the start of a chapter with her own internal monologue, with her as a temporary point-of-view character. In it, she talks about her immense dissatisfaction with her life, in particular her relationship with her co-workers. One of the main things that gets stressed in this is how sexual harassment from her superiors is something that really bothers her. It's bad to the point that she doesn't feel comfortable letting any of them know where she lives. This is pretty significant, right? It's clearly the cause of a lot of distress in her life and has shaped how she interacts with the world. The way that men view her sexually is an important part of her story. Where we go from here is that Shirakawa goes to a massage place that she's been to before, hoping to unwind. It turns out that it's a practice run by Nazuna, but she doesn't want to do any work right now, so she tries to pressure Ko into doing it. Ko initially doesn't want to, so Nazuna initially tempts him by saying he'll get the chance to put his hands all over a woman, something that he says isn't cool. This is played as a joke. Then, she gets him to do it by offering to kiss him if he does it, which motivates him. Alright, so let's line up what happened. The sexualization of women by men is an important thematic idea in this story. It just got brought up 3 times. One in her backstory, and twice when Nazuna was trying to get Ko to do her job for her. The first time, it was painted dramatically and as a source of pain for one of our point-of-view characters. Then it gets painted as setup for a joke. And then the prospect of getting sexual intimacy from a girl is an animating force for the protagonist in what isn't shown to be a personal failing of his. Now, if we're being technical here, nothing about those 3 things contradict each other on any literal level. Unwanted sexualization is always treated as bad, and the only time where it's shown to be acceptable to be motivated by is if it's clearly consensual. But also, that's not what this story is about. No effort is being taken to say, one of these things is good and the other is bad. They just sort of all are things that happen one after another. It's not a problem of self-contradiction as much as it is a lack of cohesion. You start by using sexual harassment as a dramatic plot point, and then you use the notion of it as fuel for a joke, with little attempt to transition from one to another. There's not even really any indication that the story knows that it's used this idea twice in a row. And then, in a story where some amount of narrative tension is raised around how a lot of men suck for just seeing women for their bodies, our protagonist we're meant to root for isn't exactly acting as the antithesis to that particular vice here, nor is the story making any point out of the fact that he's at least somewhat like the people we're supposed to not like. Not even just to draw an important contrast between them. There just isn't anything being done with any of this, and so none of it manages to hit. This isn't a scene about the sexualization of women, or about anything, really. It's just a scene written by a man who can't help but think of women sexually, and couldn't really think of anything else to put in there. She didn't get sexually harassed in her backstory to say anything deeper about the topic, it was just there to make her upset. That's not completely unforgivable. Like I said, it's clumsy, but it's not disastrous. It might not be a fantastic scene, but I'm sure for a lot of people it doesn't need to be. From there, though, don't worry, things get worse, but not before they briefly get better. See, he goes to give her a massage, and the two of them have what is, up until this point, the single best moment in the entire series. The two of them have a discussion about their similar life experiences, and for once the dialogue flows kind of naturally, and greater ideas are introduced in very organic ways. It's blunt, but it's also two characters talking about their emotions, so it can be blunt. You don't need to get clever with how you express that. Ko expresses the idea that he really loves the freedom that being out in the night allows him, and Shirakawa reacts with her own anecdote that expresses how she feels the same. And that's genuinely fine. That's all dialogue for a scene like this needs to be, and the story makes it flow together uncharacteristically well here. This is good dialogue. It all culminates in a climax where Shirakawa bursts into tears and expresses how much she hates working with her coworkers. She then gets a call from her boss telling her to get back to work. But then, Ko, realizing how much his life was improved by living in the night and not going back to everyday life, decides to block the door and tell this woman he's not letting her leave. Excuse me. So there are a lot of thematic problems with this moment. The first is that it's a continuation of the sexual harassment thing. I know it doesn't really look like it, but if you really think about it from Shirakawa's point of view, you can see the connection. This is a woman who's been hurt by feeling metaphorically trapped by the men in her life, forced to sit through what they want to put her through. And now someone is literally caging her in and letting her know that he knows what's best for her and that she can't leave till they're finished. Like, you see how someone with her emotional issues might find this moment to be the slightest bit disturbing, right? And how any viewer who's been relating to her might suddenly want to knee this guy in the face. Then you have the fact that the conversation we just had was all about beating the importance of freedom over the audience's head. And the protagonist just decided he would solve Shirakawa's problems for her by keeping her locked up somewhere and doing what's best for her because she clearly can't see it herself. You know, taking away her freedom in the most literal and straightforward way imaginable. Now, there is absolutely no way that this woman can realistically respond that wouldn't send this house of cards tumbling to the ground. She can't say anything about wanting freedom because then it would be apparent that the protagonist is being a hypocrite. And she can't say anything about how this feels violating either because that would make what he's doing look bad, which it is. Not just according to my own personal morals, but according to the show's own logic, what he's doing is a bad thing. So there is nothing that this woman can say about her own emotions that wouldn't contradict the point of the scene. And so, and I'm dead serious here, she doesn't say or think a single thing about what she's feeling the entire time. She just kind of acts sort of panicked and caught off guard until the situation resolves itself. How does it resolve itself? Well, Ko asks Nazuna to keep her from returning to work, so Nazuna pushes her out a window, which is played for a joke. She thinks to herself about how it all happened so fast, and she's wondering if she's about to die. And then Ko jumps out the window to grab her hand and tell her it's gonna be okay. And then, finally, Nazuna goes to save them both. When they're on the ground, the first thing she says is that she threw out her back. And yeah, that was physical assault. The second was her responding to him saying, sorry, but it was necessary. Does she get angry, chide him, shrink back in fear? Anything understandable that would represent that the author was at all thinking about her point of view or any of the ideas that this scene has brought up other than the ham-fisted point the author is trying to make? Nope! She asks him why it was necessary. Not sarcastically or indignantly or with any apparent emotion besides exhaustion, she's just genuinely curious. He tells her she shouldn't be doing a thing that makes her feel bad. She tells him he's just a kid and that adults should learn to take terrible things in stride and push through. Ko then comes in to own this woman with facts and logic through a train of reasoning that I still don't quite get. I think it's about how he's trying to become a vampire and therefore knows that being normal isn't the only option. Anyways, he goes back to chiding her and eventually convinces her, at least partially. He stands in the middle of the street while giving his speech, a reference to how in the good conversation from earlier, she said, in the night, you're free to stand in the middle of the street. This is a good detail, but the whole thing feels so hollow. It feels like it's just the author ranting to the viewer, because that's exactly what it is. It's not about what just happened, and it's not a two-way exchange. The author is just using this situation as a soapbox to preach, and yeah, that's what a story having a message is, but the key word here is just. He's just doing that. This speech doesn't tie up everything that happened just now, nor does it involve any action by the person who's supposed to be the one developing as a character. She's just sitting there having her arc explained to her. Maybe that'd be acceptable if this was a setup to her storming into her job and quitting or something, but that's not even what happens. Ko giving his speech is the climax. And I know that this is beating a dead horse, but this guy is giving her a speech about her own agency and in the same breath telling her how to live her life. This is thematically incomprehensible, and as a result, it's weak. It's a story about the struggles of this woman where everything is resolved by someone doing things for her, and she barely says anything about how she feels. There's just nothing there to appreciate besides the paper-thin aesthetic of having made a point. The scene actually continues to get worse. She gets very amicable towards him during this speech, but then gets sad because she feels like she doesn't have the freedom to live life how she wants. And instead of this being used to raise a point about, I don't know, the various ways society keeps us shackled in spite of our desires, Ko just offers to make her a vampire, which we, as readers, know means making her fall in love with him. They have a 10-year age gap. So, that's what happens when you're really clumsy with your themes. You get weak, ineffective scenes that are shadows of what you were building them up to become. But there's another huge problem with how the story handles its themes, and that's how it's just really awkward and blunt with them a lot of the time. Very early on, Nazuna asks Ko why it is that people have trouble falling asleep. She concludes that it's because they aren't satisfied with how they spent their day. I mean, for me it's typically anxiety episodes, but you know. It's not unusual for a story to have a thesis like this, but this isn't great. Like before, I'd like to start with a positive example. Attack on Titan. Attack on Titan has as one of its many messages that you can't know whether or not a decision is a good one until after the dust is settled. Now this gets used in Attack on Titan in a number of fascinating ways, but for now I want to discuss the moment this idea gets first spoken aloud within the story. In this moment, Eren and his comrades are being chased by an enemy, and he's suggesting he turn into a Titan so he can fight her. However, his captain, Captain Levi, is telling him to not do so, even though people are dying behind them to slow the enemy down. There's a plan, and they need to follow it, and the plan involves leading this enemy to a specific location. Eren is about to betray orders when his captain goes and gives him this speech about how not even he knows what the right decision is. It's just up to Eren about whether or not he wants to trust his allies. This gets Eren thinking and leads to Eren deciding to go with the plan and trust his allies. The reason this works as a scene is because Captain Levi giving this speech here holds weight within the context of the thing that's happening. In this moment, the audience is less concerned with how smart the show is and more concerned with, oh god, what's Eren gonna do? And, oh god, people are dying. But Levi's speech isn't just about the show saying something smart, it moves the scene forward. Him saying this affects Eren's decision-making in a crucial time. The audience was also already pondering this exact question, so Levi saying it gives the audience more to chew on, and it feels like a thing he'd naturally say in the moment. He feels like he's talking to Eren and not to the audience. None of this is true about Call of the Night's thesis statement. Nazuna basically spouts it out to Ko the moment she meets him. She asks him if he's having trouble sleeping, and then goes on her speech. At this moment, we've seen the protagonist goof around in the night a bit, but nothing in the speech really speaks to what we've seen of him. Like, we didn't see him having an unsatisfying day right before this, so none of what she's saying here connects super well to what we, as the audience, are currently engaged with. It just doesn't really do much for us. But there's a bigger problem here. A single moment that's a little bit ham-fisted and doesn't get much done is not that big of a problem. What is a big problem is the invisible sacrifice the author made, the thing he gave up so that he could have this pseudo-deep scene in the first chapter. He gave up giving Nazuna a proper first impression. Now, having a character go on a speech in their first scene to give you an impression of them is a very powerful trick, and it's one often used by Araki in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but there's a trick to making it work. See, in JoJo, when a villain goes on a crazy monologue, the story isn't trying to get across the same thing the villain is getting across. The story is trying to get across what the villain is like. It's characterization. But Nazuna here isn't meant to be characterized by this moment. In fact, her later characterization kind of contradicts it. She acts all mysterious and predatory here to make the scene dramatic, but she's really kind of a dweeb, which is fine, but that just means that what she's like isn't being conveyed in this first scene. What is being conveyed is what she's for. This is the story's way of telling you, this story is deep, and of saying, this girl is the one who will tell the protagonist deep stuff. Being faced with the fact that a character is going to be somewhat archetypal is one thing, but there's nothing going on around it. It's one thing to have your protagonist be given what is obviously sage, thematically important advice when they're on a quest to save the world, which will demand them to grow as a person, but it's another thing when they're given sage advice and... Because, like, what is this story even about? It's a story where Ko goes on a series of misadventures where he slowly comes to understand this thesis statement, where he learns to use the night to live his best life free from the expectations of the Daywalkers. But the misadventures he goes on aren't misadventures about living life to the fullest. They're stories about Nazuna being kind of quirky and fun to talk to, about reconnecting with a friend, about whether or not a girl likes him, and yeah, I guess a lot of those could fit tangentially into the theme of living life to the fullest because they involve not being miserable, but it feels so disconnected. The moments the story feels the most thematic are not when it's about living life to the fullest. It's when the story is about the fact that living life to the fullest is the message of the story. When Shirakawa was being given that speech by Ko, no part of that arc had them living life to the fullest. It was just them talking about how living life to the fullest is the message. There is no thematic cohesion in this story. It says its message and acts like it did its job. There's no effort to make the conflicts of the story wrap back around to the message in clear, direct ways. In terms of social commentary, we are only a few degrees more sophisticated than a Twitter post. Not a tweet thread, a Twitter post. Alright, conclusion the first. I'm gonna play devil's advocate here for just a second. Call of the Night is not without redemption. Sure, if we're judging it as an interesting and deep philosophical piece of psychological literature, something it clearly was attempting to be to some extent, it's an abject failure. But media is more complicated than that. A lot of people, when describing the story, talk about things like its vibe and how chill it is, and yeah, it is kind of chill in its presentation. There is a soft energy to it that can be easy to get swept up in if you sort of turn your brain off and let it wash over you. And a lot of the shallowness starts to work there. A lot of the things feel deep until you start thinking about them too hard, but you don't have to think about them too hard. You can think about them just enough. So much of storytelling depends on the audience and the mindset the audience is in. It's possible for all of my complaints to hold true and for the story to still be used by an audience as a means of genuine entertainment and fulfillment. It's a bit of a cliche to say that there's nothing wrong with you if you find meaning in this piece of art, and that I'm not telling you to stop enjoying it, but there is a lot of wisdom in that. I could make a whole video essay talking about the countless flaws in lots of things that I love without ever telling a lie. But I think there's unfortunately more to it than that. I don't think you're doing something wrong if you enjoy Call of the Night. You're not being factually inaccurate or hurting anyone. But you are selling yourself a bit short, I think. Because you can be doing a lot better for yourself. If you can find meaning in Call of the Night, well, there are stories that manage to do that a lot better, a lot more. This is a story that touches on really important themes like the philosophical problems with work culture and the necessity of self-actualization, but there are stories that do that while not punishing you for thinking about them. There are stories with good vibes whose visuals aren't incomplete. There are stories with cute girls that aren't full of incel nonsense. There are stories with chill dialogue whose dialogue will do so much more to engage you. And even if you are having a good time watching Call of the Night, you could be having a better time with those. Basically, I'm telling you to play Xenoblade Chronicles 3, but that's besides the point. The themes of Call of the Night are deeply personal to me. I have a lot of trouble sleeping due to crippling anxiety involving fearing I'm not doing enough with my life. I've known the shackles of society's expectations and what they can do to someone. I understand the feeling of freedom that comes from being alone at night. And that's kind of what drove me to make this video. Seeing a story posture itself as saying deep things about these important issues, seeing it praised largely for what it says about these issues, not having that much to it besides saying things about those issues, and then not saying anything remotely intelligent or poignant about those issues is kind of weird. If the show had clever dialogue, if the characters were really that interesting, if it had interesting action or whatever, then fine. But it's just characters grappling with the themes of the story and talking with each other, and the themes are so clumsily handled. whatever ways people find to enjoy this story anyways, it won't change the fact that it's kind of an abject failure in my eyes, and I really just need to explore that. For me, I've got a bit of a confession. Everything that I wrote so far was after reading only 22 chapters of the manga. I am now about to read the rest of it. I'll write the rest of the script afterwards. And who knows? Maybe the story gets better. So it's been a while on my end. It probably hasn't been on your end, but it's been a while since I last recorded. And a lot's happened in my life. Those of you who know the channel will know that I struggle with a lot of mental stuff, some pretty deep depression and anxiety as well. It has to do with, well, there was a whole thing that happened at school, but basically there was a long time where I just wasn't okay, and a lot of the gaps in my, video creation has been like that. I've actually been on YouTube for like half a decade at this point? Something close to that, but I have a very unimpressive portfolio so far because I spend so much time battling with depression that it's hard to really put out videos. I actually had the idea for this video 2.5 months ago, close to 3 months ago, back when Call of the Night only had 2 episodes out. And I was like, oh, I've got so much to say about this. I was just dying to say stuff about it. So I started writing this big script. And I'll tell you, those 3 months were not very efficiently allocated. It's not like I'm done with school. I graduated. Right now, I'm in this kind of transitionary period of my life. And I really, really wanted to buckle down and get to work on creating videos, but my mental health situation was so bad that a video that probably should have taken, maybe a little under a month to make ended up taking 3, which is better than it used to be, but it's still not great. This is like my 3rd time trying to word this, but I've talked about how the themes of Call of the Night kind of relate to me. And, a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm very unhappy, I don't think is quite the word. There is this disconnect between me and the life that I kind of feel like I've been expected to live till now that has really had deep consequences for my psyche. And I kind of realized that what I need to do is I need to take control of my life and say, I want to do these things, and so I'm going to do them, and I'm not going to do what I think I should want to do. I'm going to do what I want to do. And that's why I've been trying to put more effort into this channel over the past few months, but it's kind of a, chicken and the egg situation, because I want to find success doing something that makes me happy, so that, I don't have to be miserable all the time, but I can't put in the time that needs because, I've got no serotonin to spare, I guess. Which is actually why me and my family had been looking into some treatments. One of the things that we actually found, psilocybin, better known as magic mushrooms, it's a psychedelic drug, but it also is known to have a lot of healing properties with regards to the mind. It's been used to treat all kinds of things from trauma to OCD, and it all has to do with neuroplasticity, and it's trauma breaks certain pathways in your brain, but this can cause them to regrow, something like that. While in the time since the last recording, I actually I went on a shroom trip, a supervised shroom trip by a professional who guided me through the whole thing to make sure that it was a healing process that I got a lot out of, and it really, really worked. It's funny, actually pretty shortly after I did that, and after I recovered from the initial thing, because it's actually a pretty physically strenuous thing. I'm not looking forward to doing it again. I don't plan on doing it again anytime soon. Headache is The headache was a lot. The shroom trip was really transformative. But once I was recovered, I actually got sick, and I had a few days where I was recovering from that. And I remember thinking to myself, just like, oh, this is a perfect time to record. Everyone's out of the house. I have a chance to record. I really want to record. I'm sure I'm not that sick. And then I realized something, and it's that I was like, for the first time in so long, I was looking for an excuse to do work instead of an excuse to not do it. And then later on, today, actually, this morning, it was the day where I was feeling good enough to do proper recording. Wasn't worried I was going to strain myself too much. And early on in the day, I had an anxiety attack due to something stupid. And I realized that I hadn't had an anxiety attack in a few days, which was kind of abnormal for me. And, in that moment, I realized, wow, I really am starting to claw my way out of this hole. And I began, to really move forward with confidence this morning because I truly believed that panic attack was something that would pass by the time it was time to do the things that were important to me, to do this recording. And speaking of things that are transient and destined to end, let's talk about that time it looked like Call of the Night was going to get good for a second. Oh, that joke was not worth the setup. Like and subscribe. For real though, please do like and subscribe. The analytics really help. I am trying to grow this channel. It'd be really appreciated. Also, I have a Patreon. So as it turns out, the story did get better. Sort of, it's complicated. All right, so Call of the Night is a story that starts out without much of a plot. You eventually get an antagonist in the form of the Vampire Titty Council, but that doesn't really actualize in the way that you'd want. They get introduced as wanting to kill Yamori if he doesn't become a vampire, but their presence in the story from that point moving forward is rarely, if ever, used to build tension. Scenes with them aren't meant to be particularly threatening or anything. As a result, the story really fails to properly come together. The motivations of the protagonist for Ko to turn into a vampire are in relation to certain stakes. Ko trying to learn about love is supposed to feel meaningful because it might be what keeps him from getting killed, but every time the characters who might kill him show up, it's just kinda casual, Things do start to come together, however, with the introduction of my personal favorite character, the detective. She shows up somewhere in the 30s chapters-wise, and instantly steals the show. She's a private eye and a vampire slayer whose goal is to kill every vampire. She's charismatic, she's a hot mess, she's a very credible threat, she's a fantastic addition to the story. This decision works for a number of reasons. First off, the story is now about trying to stop a vampire hunter, which is more interesting than what it was about, which is to say, a story about a boring person's journey of self-discovery. It went from a character study of a blank slate to a story which merely stars a blank slate. The introduction of an actual, credible threat obviously builds up the tension and gets you engaged, both during the awesome scenes that she's in and in the show at large. And it works especially well because it adds weight to Ko's personal goals. If he doesn't become a vampire, the Vampire Titty Council will maybe kill him. If he does become a vampire, the detective is going to try to kill him herself. Not to mention, he's making a lot of vampire friends, and we've been there to see him develop those friendships, and now those friendships are at risk on account of the fact that someone is trying to kill his friends. This makes the moments he shares with those friends feel impactful. I love it. It's awesome. 10 out of 10. Fantastic decision. But okay, so the story has a bit of a problem, and that problem is that it doesn't really know what to do with itself a lot of the time. It has an antagonist, but there isn't enough for that antagonist to do to fill up the time the author wants her arc to take up, so the arc is filled with stuff other than trying to stop a vampire slayer. We enter this really brilliant arc that makes the story finally work, and then spend a minority of time on it. A lot of time is instead spent on making non-exciting plot arcs last longer than they need to. The story certainly seems to want to tell us the backstories of its core supporting cast, but it never just gives us the backstory. What it always has to do, for some reason, is construct an entire plot around them finding out the backstory, and it's always just them sort of milling about this new environment, getting into unimpressive hijinks, and hearing some emotional monologues until they finally get around to the important part. And so you have a situation like this. In the middle of an ongoing conflict against a vampire slayer, Nazuna decides she wants to explore her past to discover herself. So they go to a school she used to go to where Ko gets into a random side plot with some girl with emotional issues that doesn't really tie into the greater story and that takes up a good chunk of pages. We learn Nazuna had an old friend who used to go here with her that we spend a whole bunch of time building up, and we learn that they went to the same club, that they were good friends, that her mother was killed by a vampire, and at this point it's obvious that this girl grew up to be the detective, but we're not getting there for a bit, so hold your breath. Then we have an entire backstory where Nazuna and this girl investigate whether or not her father is cheating, and they bond over that, only for the girl to come home and see her father admit he was cheating, apologize to everyone, but then go into a psychotic break where he drains all of his wife's blood, by the way he's a vampire, and he has to be killed by his own daughter. We then leave the backstory, wrap things up, and finally reveal that she was indeed the detective, and all of that takes 15 chapters. All to reveal that these two characters had a past together. And this is not long after they spent 8 chapters in a hospital in order to learn about the fact that Nazuna was born a vampire rather than being turned, all of the important bits of which were explained in a 3-chapter flashback that the other 5 chapters existed to justify. The story could be using its time better, is my point. Sure, it's not like nothing happens in these chapters, but all of this is time which isn't spent on keeping up the tension. So the end result is that we're more or less back to the level of quality that we had before our antagonist showed up. This all comes to a head in the mid-80s where we finally get our climactic showdown against the detective. It's on Halloween and we have setup showing us that she has a big dramatic plan to kill all the vampires. All things considered, I was pretty excited for this. She tends to make the quality of the story skyrocket after all, but well, here's what happened. She goes around shooting all of the vampires, wounds which they simply heal from, and she runs away from danger after they start chasing her. Eventually, she has a showdown between her and Nazuna, and she warns Nazuna that she's called Ko to their location and she'll kill him if Nazuna doesn't kill her first. Nazuna and her have a big fight, Ko shows up, and then Ko reveals that the detective won't kill him because her plan isn't to kill him, it's to convince Nazuna to kill her, which makes no sense because she easily could have gotten killed by Nazuna prior to this moment if she didn't dodge all of Nazuna's attacks. But don't worry, her plan gets even dumber. See, her reason for wanting to get killed by a vampire is because if she gets killed in a way which clearly could only be done by super strength, that would lead to an investigation that concludes there is some kind of metahuman race out there, which would lead to the revelation of the existence of vampires, which would lead to people avoiding roaming the streets at night, which would leave vampires without a food source, and therefore vampires would all starve to death because they die if they don't drink blood for 10 years. Alright, let's go into all of the myriad problems with this, though I'll probably miss a lot of them. So a good chunk of problems with this can be reasonably categorized under... Wait, I thought we were just suspending disbelief about the fact that vampires were still unknown to society. Like, this plan acts as if vampires are completely unknown to society, as things are, but this would finally reveal them, but if this plan was enough to make the world aware of vampires, we'd know about them already. So little time has been dedicated thus far to building up the actual world building around just what exactly is keeping vampires from becoming known to society that this all feels weirdly out of left field, kind of like it's treading on ground it's not supposed to. I get that she's suicidal, and this is mostly just an elaborate justification to herself to let herself die, but even bringing up this subject matter is a really odd choice. The entire conflict centers around us thinking about something which the story has thus far relied on us not thinking that hard about. Also, there was this time when she could have let someone other than Nazuna kill her with super strength in an alleyway that was within the sightline of a crowd of people, and I get that she wanted it to be Nazuna who kills her. But once again, she didn't give Nazuna a chance to until it was too late and Ko showed up. But the biggest problem here is that the only way to rationalize why the villain did the plan the way she did was that she was dumb and didn't think it through properly, or at least was letting her emotions cloud her judgment, which altogether means that it wasn't really a test of the hero's skills that they've developed thus far, and you built up this cunning badass who fights monsters while having a normal person's physical capability, and she just doesn't do much of anything that impressive. Like, she dodges some attacks and holds her own alright, but you thought she was going to do something clever? But the genius plan which Ko had to outsmart was stupid. It's just a question if it was stupid in character or out of character. And what really ties all of this together is that all of this has to do with the villain's motivations, which in turn have to do with vampires and oh man, are the vampires in this story dumb. Okay, so there's a big problem with vampires in this story, and that's that they're fine. They're fine. They can live perfectly normal lives without killing anyone or hurting them. There's nothing wrong with being a vampire, only with certain vampires. And yet, a lot of the story is about, like, whether or not vampires existing is okay. Like, let's really think about the reveal that a vampire killed the detective's mother. Like, this is her motivation for becoming a mass murderer. She spent 10 years of her life killing vampires. She has a body count. And all of this ended in her attempting to spark a genocide. And a big part of her motivation is that her life was ruined by someone who was a vampire. We know vampires can avoid killing people when drinking blood, and it seems like her father was just having a psychotic break, so it's not really because he was a vampire. Just replace the word vampire with black person and tell me if this is still a deep or interesting character detail that makes her more sympathetic. She's my favorite character, don't get me wrong, but that's because she's so entertaining. There is no justifying the stuff she does in the story because she is once again a serial killer. And there's a lot of build up to her talking about how vampires are dangerous, but it never wraps back around to some unavoidable fact of what being a vampire is like. Okay, so they need to drink blood. They don't need much. There are a lot of vampires who are kind of crappy people, and one thing that really strikes me is that they go on about how vampires have this, like, urge to reproduce by turning other people, and that's compared to sex, but it's clearly not something they need to do since there are vampires who choose not to do it. So it just kind of reads like there are some whose sex drive is so strong that they need to, like, let it out, even if it means tricking someone. And there is a lot that happens from turning someone into a vampire unwillingly. Their life does kind of turn upside down. They lose some memories even. So doing that will, like, it screws a guy up. If you do that without consent, just because of your reproductive urges, that's, you know, a little bit, you feel me? But there are plenty of vampires who don't try to do that, and they don't face any problems from it. The author wanted to write a story about cute vampire girls, but didn't want the baggage that comes from actual vampires, so he watered them down. But then he had to write a story about those watered down vampires, and unsurprisingly, it was a little light on anything gripping. I'm trying to think of, like, what vampires could possibly be a metaphor for. Like, vampires have their own society, and it's something people can join from the outside. Plus, there's, like, a lot of theming that implies sucking blood is sexual in some ways, or the whole thing almost feels like a metaphor for the LGBT community, which would be kind of gross given how predatory a lot of them are portrayed, but also there just are gay and bi people all over the story, and it's treated so casually that, like, no, that's not what they're a metaphor for. That doesn't make any sense. They're not quite a race, nor are they really a subculture, and don't get me wrong, groups of people in stories do not need to be one-to-one allegories for real-world groups of people. Goblins and Goblin Slayer, for example, are a metaphor for mundane evils, like lead in the water pipes, but Call of the Night is a story about, like, what it's like to be a vampire and whether or not you should turn into one. If it is a stand-in for something, it's a very poorly and crudely constructed one, which just leads me to believe that they are vampires just because the author kind of likes vampires and thinks they're hot. And so we're spending all this time on something which not only doesn't make for an effective allegory, but also just isn't that interesting until you throw in a serial killer, and even then the initial vampire premise doesn't really justify the serial killer plot. This story kind of comes off sometimes like it's searching for a genre, if that makes any sense. It starts out with a version of vampires that works for slice of life, but the author isn't good at writing slice of life, so he wanders into more of a fantasy thriller, but the world doesn't work for that, so he just sends us on a fetch quest for some flashbacks and dedicates a bunch of time to trying to be deep, but it doesn't really work. Alright, let's talk about the themes. Okay, so I was going to add a section here about how the story fails at being deep, but as it turned out, that's a little bit difficult. Not because the story is deep, but because the story eventually gets so shallow in how it interrogates its themes that accusing it of deep almost feels like off, because that implies that it was trying. Okay, so at the first, we have this concept of the night, right? The night, and how it's this big freeing place to be. And sure, none of those ideas end up getting developed in the slightest. And it really just becomes this thing that the story name drops intermittently for aesthetic purposes, but, like, I guess you could just use it for that. It's this weird dissonance where the show clearly thinks of itself as deep and insightful and meaningful, but also kind of knows that it's not. I'm struggling to describe it because it kind of doesn't make any sense. I think a good illustrative moment is when the detective tells one of the vampires that they should cherish the night while it lasts or whatever, because she's gonna end the night. And that sounds like it's this symbolic thing. It's how you'd write it if the night had some deeper, grand meaning in the story's thematic framework. Like, this would feel appropriate if the detective kind of resents vampires, because vampires represent freedom, and she doesn't like freedom, because having too much freedom ruined her life, or someone else's freedom ruined her life, and she's going to do some grand plan that gets rid of their freedom, places new shackles on them, or something to that effect. Something deeply tied into the story's thematic framework, but it's actually a lot more literal. She's just gonna make it not safe for them to hunt at night anymore, and that's literally it. A few examples are as clear-cut as this, but, like, the entire story radiates this exact energy. Almost a kind of cognitive dissonance. Easily one of the worst ways that it handles its themes, though, is the way that it tackles abuse, which is actually a pretty prominent idea late in the story. Ko has this friend named Mahiru, who was neglected by his parents growing up, and that weakness is being used by a vampire named Kiku to lure him in and lead him down the wrong path. It's a bit more complicated than that, but the idea is that he's bouncing between abusive situations, and Kiku is the main antagonist after the detective gets Vegetated and joins the good guys because, oh yeah, Ko stops her from committing suicide and she stops wanting to kill vampires. Saying that out loud sounds kind of dumb and hokey, but I actually kind of liked it. Anyways, abuse. So, abuse is very difficult to discuss in purely literary terms because it's kind of a call and response theme. You have the call, the abusive behavior, and then the response, the victim having their life be made worse. In a story, the way you would depict abuse is by showing both of those things one after another, but sometimes you only have the first. Lean on Me, for example, is ostensibly a movie about a poor black neighborhood school getting a new principal who whips things into shape and helps students succeed. Substantively, though, it's 1 hour and 48 minutes of Morgan Freeman emotionally abusing children. But the movie treats his actions like they would have positive consequences, so is Lean on Me a story about abuse? Call of the Night is interesting because it sort of straddles the line between acknowledging and ignoring abuse. See, Kiku is shown to be an abuser. The story goes into detail to show realistically how the power she holds over Mahiru, as a result of her vastly greater life experience and economic independence, leads to him being in a relationship where he's not an equal. He's emotionally manipulated into cutting ties with people in his life, and it makes him worse off as a result. Clearly, this is showing off how it is bad for older women to romantically entice younger men who don't know how to handle that kind of relationship properly. Except for the fact that this is happening in a story that very specifically glorifies that exact thing. It's not just Nazna and Ko forming a relationship. Everywhere in the story, the idea of young men with older women is normalized. No one who hears about a kid having a relationship with an adult goes, "Oh god, this is a terrible thing," and people constantly joke about it. Even the detective teases Ko about, like, him hitting on her during their early meetings or whatever. Nazna is, like, in her 50s, and everyone thinks Ko and her ending up together is probably fine. All of this would at least be coherent if the story was consistent about it. But then it follows up with an antagonist who's basically the exact thing you would show if you wanted to critique how Call of Night had been handling this idea thus far. And what am I even supposed to make of this? Is the message just to date the right older woman? Maybe. But that can't be it, right? Like, the story has to be trying to say something more than some people are good people who'll treat you right and others won't do that. It's that dissonance again. Clearly, it's trying to say something about abuse, but it also isn't saying anything about abuse. Maybe that abuse is bad. Maybe it's trying to depict abuse because it's a serious problem that needs light shown on it. Maybe it's just something to make you emotionally invested. And yeah, if those were the reasons, then it was a success. But, like, it plays into this deeper overarching problem. See, there's this girl, Lyra, who's really tall. And growing up, she got made fun of for being really tall. She gets a big crush on Ko, but it's revealed that she periodically gets a crush on some random boy, hoping for a fairy tale romance, only to dump them once the magic is gone. And then she does that exact thing to Ko after having some conversations with him. Now, this whole arc is clearly supposed to be meaningful in some way. It's trying to get us to think, I just don't know what it's trying to get us to think about. In a story like Attack on Titan, all of the deep emotional moments kind of like connect, if that makes any sense. Like, when, spoilers by the way, Reina chooses not to kill himself because Gabi and Falco still need him. It makes you think of these other times people made similar decisions to keep living for some goal. And it also informs future decisions of his. And everything kind of connects into this big interlocking picture. But with Call of the Night, it's like, yeah, that person sure had emotional issues. The purpose of Lyra wasn't to juxtapose something or force Ko to face some reality that affects how he acts from then on, nor are we watching Lyra be a three-dimensional character while she attempts to do something plot relevant. The story just kind of showcases that she is indeed an interesting concept for a character and leaves it at that. This story is like a jigsaw puzzle. If none of the pieces were actually designed to fit together, but it looked like it would make a really pretty painting. Here's the thing, I've been holding something back. You know how I described the story as searching for a genre? Well, something interesting happened around the 90 chapter mark. It transformed from a terrible psychological drama to a half-decent battle shonen, and now I kinda like it. So a few things happened when we entered the Kiku arc. First off, a lot more fight scenes started happening. Vampires have super strength, but they also have other abilities, like phasing through walls that have a bunch of rules that make for entertaining fights. The author is really good at them, as a matter of fact. Like, compared to how good he is at dialogue and theming, I mean. These are genuinely engaging. Yamori gets turned into a half-vampire, so he gets super strength temporarily when he's worked up and also bleeding, and he has to go through a whole arc to control it, and it's like, fun! And there's stakes and evolution, and it's a freaking battle shonen. He becomes stronger than most other vampires when he's like this, but because it's hard to control, it's actually balanced, which makes for these really cool back and forths. Around this time, the plot gets a lot better, too. Kiku is hateable, and she makes for a great villain, especially because of Mahiru. Ko's friendship with him is one of the more interesting dynamics in the story, and I'm actually invested in it because you get to see it deteriorate over time due to Kiku's influence, and you have Akira as this third member who feels grounded and like she has a place in the dynamic, and it all fits together. See, Ko is looking for a place he belongs, and he doesn't realize how much he means to Mahiru, who is really popular but only is able to open up around Ko and Akira. So it's a place Ko belongs, which is really nice, and seeing him lose that sucks. And him deciding he wants to face down Mahiru and settle things, patch things up, is a motivation that the readers can get behind. We get a new cast, too. The Vampire Titty Council fades into the background, and instead, the main gang are Ko, Nazuna, Akira, and the detective, so pretty much the most interesting characters thus far, plus two more characters who the heroes had beaten in a fight earlier. And they're both very likable and interesting, but they aren't interesting in that pretentious way where they have some dramatic but not that original emotional issue that we're going to get 5 chapters of flashback over one day. They just have interesting motivations and distinct personalities and good chemistry with the rest of the cast. It's great! It's kind of wild to me how much the story transformed to the point that I'm actually looking forward to what happens next. Like, that's new for this story in me. And it helps that they're taking things in a good direction. Mahiru and Ko both wanted to go to this place together one day, and that's where the school trip this year is going to. And Mahiru said Ko would know where Mahiru is heading, and so Ko guesses it's that place. And so we have Ko going back to school and getting ready for this trip, and we finally see him meeting back with all these people we had only till now seen him talk to in flashbacks, and it's this really natural build-up to a climax of the story that just feels great. What really ties this together is that now Ko is a good, interesting character. We spent so much time on a bland character learning to not be bland that we finally got a protagonist who isn't bland anymore. He has this very casual feeling that he's cool and above everything that results from him dealing with so much wild fantasy stuff, and it's played both to make him seem cool and to poke fun at him for it. It works really well. He forms this interesting relationship with all of his peers, who notice he's different but don't mind it. Till now he was fake around them, but now he always says things as he sees them. He's honest, and he's accepted for it. He's also proactive and kind and attentive, and sometimes a bit of a dick, and all of it comes around to a protagonist where I want to see what he does next. There's also this fun aspect of his adult friends being on the same train as his class, and everyone being curious about what he has to do with them, and that's just the fun exploration of wacky ideas and fun dynamics that we couldn't have when Ko's dynamic with everyone in his life was sitting by while they act kind of dramatic. None of this is to say the story suddenly became a masterpiece, but it finally became good. As good as all these people on YouTube are claiming it is, while the anime is still in the worst part of the story. So if you like Call of the Night, I don't know if the changes are going to make you really happy or really disappointed, but it strikes me that from my experience with this story, this manga that is praised for its chill vibes didn't become engaging or even good until it lost its chill. This author is the person who made Dagashi Kashi, which I have not read, but I do know that it's not a battle shonen. Probably. I haven't checked. But when this guy is done with Call of the Night, I really hope he moves on to make a battle shonen, because he'd probably be really good at it. And that notion genuinely excites me. Yeah, we're actually ending this video on a positive note. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, please like, please leave a comment. All that stuff helps with the algorithm and helps me get this stuff seen. I want to, grow my channel as much as I can. Also, consider subscribing to my Patreon. It's got some pretty fun reward tiers, especially the expensive one, though, probably no one's going to do that this early on. Probably not till I get a lot more popular, hopefully, with any luck. The next thing I'm going to work on, I'll probably do a couple of smaller things for this next season, but the main thing I'm working on is a really, really big project, even bigger than this one. I've already written most of the script by the time that this has come out, but I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It is on an anime that we've already covered on this channel, but just doing an absurdly deep dive into it, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. I think people are going to have a really, really good time with it. And I've had a lot of fun, doing the writing so far. I think we're going to have a lot of fun recording it, especially since, I had so much fun recording today after, the shrooms.